I mean, I first knew you through your wonderful book, Saving Eutychus.
Yeah.
That's such a joy to read that book. It really, genuinely, it really is.
Oh, that's encouraging. I think it's something I think we look back on doing with real fondness. But I think part of it is like there are a lot of uh, because it probably much better and much more worthy books on preaching. But they're all very aspirational.
Yes, yes,
I think we tried to write a book. When Phil and I met, it was actually, I think we both realized that I suppose we'd had a lot to work out a lot of things ourselves,
hmm
and also, or to piece together bits and pieces that wise and godly people had shared with us along the way. But as we started to talk about preaching, we realized, oh, hang on, this may actually be helpful,
mm.
for the mass of people. I think there's still obviously a place to be there. Books on preaching I love and move me and shape me, but that aren't claiming to be the definitive work, but
Yes,
are actually kind of down among the weeds where most of us live most of the time. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, like you, I've read many, many books on preaching, and most of them they cover much the same ground 90% of the time, express it slightly
yeah,
differently or whatever. But every now and then, and yours is definitely there's just that refreshing, down to earth reality about it. And as you say, we're all messy, living in a messy world. Preaching is never as clear cut and straightforward as some of the books would seem to suggest. What do you do with it when it hits the real world? So
yeah. And I think, I mean, it's I don't know if you find this, but finding yourself in a teaching role
mm,
where I think certainly when I started, I had to spend quite a lot of time trying to reverse engineer the
yes,
things the things that I thought that I'd learned along the way. That in God's kindness they had happened, but they hadn't necessarily happened in a sensible order.
yes,
But to be able to try to unpack those and say, okay,
yep,
right, there's a blank sheet sitting in front of you on Monday morning, or
yes, yes,
how do we actually step through this process in a way that works for us as individuals,
yes,
recognizing that we're all quite different,
yeah,
and yet doing it in a thoughtful way that will be for the benefit of God's people.
yes, yeah. Yeah, it's a really helpful point, which I sort of came to realize a number of years ago. Is when you start teaching something, you have a much better understanding of how and why you do what you do, but you never had to analyze it or break it down.
Yes, yeah,
I've learned
yeah.
so
I
much more
think
about
that
preaching
that
by teaching it.
yeah, I'm the same, and
No.
people, I mean, this all happens, but especially when I started at the college here in Brisbane, the students would say, "I see you did this in College Chapel. Why did you do that?"
Yes.
And sometimes I was having to go, "Just give me a second. Okay, hang on.
Yes.
There is a reason in there,
Yes.
But I think also it is that challenge of, on the one hand, trying to get to the point where we're comfortable in our own skin.
Yeah.
We're comfortable with who we are, and we know how we kind of get from the text to the sermon and how we preach,
Yes.
but also being thoughtful and willing to change, and also able to break that down to the extent where you can go, okay, here's what I do.
hmm
You may not have to do it like this,
Yes.
but you will have, these things will have to be in there in
Yes.
whatever that looks like for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I sometimes say to my
Because I
students,
mean,
the way I do it may not be the only way to do it, but if you don't have another way of doing it, this is the only way you've got for now
that's,
until you gain some
I said
experience
here.
yourself.
I say to our students too, when I talk about kind of my process, I said, look, this is my process. It is a mixture of things that I've borrowed, stolen
Yes.
from other people, stumbled on myself, and there are some bits that are just there because that's the way my mind works.
Exactly right.
And
Yes.
I can't give you a good reason for doing it like that, but nor can I do it any other way.
Yes. Yes.
But
Yeah.
I do think there's freedom in that, because again, being forced to teach preaching, it's starting to think about, okay, what is it? The people who I love to listen to are very different,
Mm-hmm.
and often from different parts of the world and different traditions.
Yes.
What is it? what is it that makes these people, like at a human level, effective
Sure.
preachers,
Yeah.
under God?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and it's quite clear that at least part of it is that they have to be themselves.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
That there is something um, particular, I think, about the Scottish kind of Reformed tradition
Yes, that's true.
that is suspicious. Mr. Still had a method
Yes.
of, of sorts, but but it did seem so beautifully organic.
Yes. Yes.
And at points it did sound, it could sound a little bit like, him sitting with an open Bible
I agree. Yeah.
and just off he went. And
Yes.
I think there is something very rich and real
Yes.
about that it is authentic.
Yes.
But I think sometimes in our tradition we can be just a little bit kind of sniffy about method.
Yeah.
That there is, I mean, there is something supernatural about the act of preaching.
Yeah.
And I think we can over engineer preaching, but I think we can also under engineer. And
I'm with you.
sometimes
Yeah.
there are people who've been very helpful to me because I've just listened to them,
Yes.
and I've tried to work out what they were doing. But there have been a couple of people where I remember, there's a man called John Woodside who had a remarkable ministry in Kilkenny and then in Drogheda in the Republic of Ireland, an Irish Presbyterian. John was a great preacher. If you asked John a question about preaching, he just said, "I just kind of explain the word and apply it to people." You're going, thanks, a little more
Yes.
would
Yes.
be helpful. But he was a marvelous preacher and a godly pastor whom God used to grow two remarkable churches.
Yeah. Yeah.
But was never all that helpful in kind of passing on, to
Yes.
those of us following. Here are 5 things you
Yes.
really should do.
A bit frustrating sometimes, people like that in the nicest possible way. I know what you
Yes, yeah,
mean.
yeah.
That's right. That's right. Gary, it's great to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking time at
No,
the
not
end of
at
a
all. It's
busy
a
day for
delight.
you. So it's a joy. Could you first of all just introduce yourself to us? Just give us a little cameo picture of who you are and your ministry.
So, my name is Gary Millar, principal of Queensland Theological College in Brisbane, in Queensland, which is the very large top right hand corner of Australia. About 2 million people live in Brisbane. The college is historically it's the Presbyterian college. About 40% of our students go to Presbyterian churches, and the other 60% kind of Gospel Coalition type, gospel centered churches, Reformed Baptist Independents, a few Anglicans, Reformed Charismatics, that kind of world. So I've been here for almost 14 years. Before that, for 12 years, I was a minister of two Presbyterian churches in Dublin, where under God kind of went to what had been a rare thing in Irish Presbyterian churches, but a very liberal church, where my predecessor had been there for 37 years. To give you a snapshot, one person not long before I went asked if they could have a Bible study, and he laughed and said, "You're going to the wrong kind of church." So it was very small, old style skeptical liberalism, but also very upper class Protestant obviously in a city that's massively Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
So again, in God's grace, we see the small churches grow to kind of larger, smallish churches, and another church was planted just to the north of Dublin,
Great.
and then actually that church has recently planted another church. So that's encouraging. Before that, I grew up just a place called Lisburn, just outside Belfast, in Northern Ireland. Studied at Queen's in Belfast, went to Aberdeen. Went after my time at Aberdeen, went and did a PhD in Oxford on Deuteronomy. I know this sounds a bit weird, but with hindsight, I actually went to do it because I didn't feel at the end of my time at Aberdeen I was in any way equipped to preach the Old Testament.
Okay.
And with hindsight, I can't quite remember what the logic was that going to do a PhD was a good way to equip you to preach the Old Testament. But again, I think God was very gracious, and I think having the time to think and reflect on Deuteronomy and how the Old Testament fitted together was really quite an important time for me,
Mm.
In thinking through kind of
Mm.
how all the scriptures point to Christ and what it might look like to encourage God's people from the Old Testament.
Mm. Wonderful, wonderful. That's a neglected part of the Bible for preaching, isn't it? I mean, the Old Testament, never mind Deuteronomy, but
Yeah.
so, Guy, how did you sense at the beginning that God's call on your life was for a preaching ministry?
Um, I grew up in a what was then called the Church Extension Church, the kind of overspill of Belfast to the surrounding cities, large Presbyterian movement out of the city. So I grew up in a new kind of growing church. One of the strengths of that church, well, from my point of view, was that a bunch of us were encouraged to do things, probably before we had the wisdom or really knew enough to do them very well. But my own minister encouraged me, and I remember, I think probably a fairly unwise youth leader telling me after I think I'd done a public prayer, in church, and the youth leader told me that she was actually in no doubt that God had called me to the ministry, and at 16, I should, almost pack in school and go off and do that. And I remember speaking to my parents about that, who weren't quite so convinced as she was, understandably. But I think that did plant a seed, and I did chemistry at uni because partly I couldn't really think of anything else to do. Did it, really enjoyed it, but I do remember after about a term at university sitting thinking, this is fine. I mean, I like being here, but I can't do this for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing really that I wanted to do was to preach Christ. And I think that was a conviction that never really left me.
Yeah, yeah.
I think, I mean, with hindsight, I do think at several points during my journey, I could have been asked a few more hard questions, and I'd pushed a bit harder on areas that I wasn't. But yeah, but I think it was set in my mind and heart. It was really settled when I was about 18,
Right. Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
just kind of kept down that trajectory. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Who have been the sort of influences on you and the shapers on you in terms of preaching?
Um, when I was about 21, I read John Stott's "I Believe in Preaching," and I thought, I remember reading it, going, of course, that's what I've sort of stumbled towards.
Mm.
That's what I want to do. That's how I think that's I think what the basic diet of the church should be. And then someone at that point encouraged me, rather than staying in Belfast, to study, to go to Aberdeen, essentially to go to Gilcomston,
Mm-hmm.
and sit under the ministry there, which was massively impactful. I think if you wanted a living example of a church built, as Mr. Still used to say repeatedly, built on the ministry of the word, nourished by prayer. It's kind of what was beaten into you, and that was formative. And I think whilst again, I don't think anyone could ever have preached like Mr. Still.
Mm-hmm.
At one level, he was a kind of terrible model, but on another level, it was just that having God speak week by week, as his idea of an introduction was just John chapter 4 verse 7, having stopped at 6 a week before, but I think that cemented my convictions.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just hearing my father-in-law preach,
Mm-hmm.
Warner Hardy, in one way a kind of very unglamorous ministry, as you know, in a tough part of Scotland,
Mm-hmm.
and a fairly low socioeconomic church, and seeing because of his tireless,
Mm-hmm.
faithful exposition of the scriptures and passionate application of the gospel to people's hearts. Seeing people become Christians, grow as Christians, in some cases then, end up serving Christ elsewhere as they were promoted or went off to college. That had a formative influence. I spent a little bit of time, not much, with Roy Clements.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think some things that I spent a couple of days with seminar with Roy, there were some insights that he had that really did shape me and impact me. And then after that, I think there've been people like Alistair Begg and listening to Sinclair and a little bit of exposure to some of the to some of the Prot Trust stuff with Dick Lucas in the early days, that, and just and then again contact with Australia, some people like Simon Manchester and Ray Galea, just that fellowship of, I think God's been very kind and he's brought lots of people into my life who are really passionate about preaching and just keep at it.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in Dublin, I was part of a group that's still running called the Irish Preachers Conference, which was for 12 years was the first week in my calendar every year, partly because it was just that hands-on encouragement to keep growing and developing, stretching ourselves, getting to know the scriptures better, match with it became a kind of de facto kind of pastors gathering for those of us in the Republic of Ireland who were theologically on the same page, shared a philosophy of ministry.
Yes.
So there were just lots of individuals, people like John Samuel, some people would know, who just then, I think, constantly spurred me on to keep growing. And I think that's something that I think certainly in our context in Australia, I'm concerned about that moving forward, because I think we're focusing on a whole pile of other good things, church planting, ensuring that church is growing properly, kind of church systems have a good, I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but doing church really well. But then there's also, kind of negotiating some of the sensitivities around language and how we need to adjust and pastoral care and so on. And I think there's a danger for us that we think, oh yeah, preaching, we've got that.
Okay.
We're totally committed to preaching, absolutely. But we're not there. I'm not sure that lots of pastors and church leaders are working on their preaching, for the rest of their lives.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's been my journey. Okay. So there've been lots of small influences. Oh, the other person I should mention is an Australian, John Chapman.
Oh yes, yeah.
And in 1998, 97, 98, when I was in Bangor in Northern Ireland, I met Chapo as the associate in the church. I got the job of running a 2-week evangelistic mission that Chapo was doing. And I think at that stage, I had lost confidence in my ability to preach evangelistically. I was totally persuaded, I wanted to open up the scriptures. I felt I could do that. But when it came to actually kind of encouraging people to kind of commit to Christ, I always felt like when I heard myself do it, I thought, nah, Billy Graham can do that. You can't. Or, I would hear other models and I would go, I don't even sound like I'm convincing myself, and I'm embarrassed. I just haven't, I don't know how to do this. And Chapo, when I first heard him, I just went, oh, that's how you do it. And it was like clarity in the message and how the message flowed out the scriptures. And then he had worked for a lifetime at presenting the choice we all face to people in a way that was respectful, but crystal clear, and also with the expectation that people would respond.
Yeah.
And I just thought, I could do that. And he actually, when he left, he made me promise that I would preach evangelistically in the next 3 weeks and send him a cassette to Sydney for him to listen to and give me feedback. And then I mean, that's ultimately after a long chain of events, we ended up in Australia because Chapo brought me out for a month to work with him in the Department of Evangelism
Okay.
of the Sydney Diocese for a
Right.
month in 2002, and then
Right.
kind of there was a strange chain of events.
Yeah.
But so I think Chapo taught me to preach evangelistically. But the other thing he taught me was I never heard him say this, but I just saw him do it all the time. He clearly he wrote a sermon in a way that it was like he was putting his arm around the listener
Mm-hmm.
at the start of the talk and was gently leading them to the end.
Okay.
And so even realizing when there was a part of his talk that was a bit sticky
Mm-hmm.
or difficult, the way in which he did that,
Mm.
and also, he never said, I never heard him say he did this, but he was a master at allowing people a way back in,
Right.
to the talk if they'd nodded off,
Yes.
so, he used to come and do stuff for us in Dublin, and he would say, of course, if you've nodded off, now would be a great time to come back up for air. And, you won't have missed much. And it was always done with a light touch.
Yes. Yes.
But I just realized, okay, he's actually thinking very hard about how he takes the listener.
Yes.
I think all of us hope that that people are still awake when we get to the end. But I realized I'd never given very much thought.
Yeah.
I was just like, I've got to do this as earnestly and passionately as I can,
Mm-hmm.
and it's your job. It's your job to stick with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And listening to Chapo made me go, oh, okay. That I can actually help people.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
He was a remarkable communicator, wasn't he? Just a great example of evangelism. That's superb. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think he was. I mean, he was a very big personality,
Yes.
but
Absolutely. Yeah.
he was also a great example of how to harness how to rightly harness your personality
Yes. Yes.
in the service of the gospel.
Yes. Yeah.
So there were times where he would, he would tell me there were some times he had to drop illustrations because they were too good, which is generally not a problem most of us have. But he was
Yeah.
such a hilarious storyteller. That
Yes. Yes.
he would. I remember him telling me about he realized because there was a story involving a car crash where an uninsured driver had run into the back of him. And I can't remember what the illustration was, but he said he had to drop it because every second person coming out of the church asked him, did you get your money back?
Yes.
Did he ever pay for the car? So little
Yeah.
things like that. And I
Yeah.
think for me too, I mean, a formative, although it wasn't a person, a very formative experience for me was moving from a church called Hamilton Road
Mm-hmm.
Presbyterian in
Yeah.
Bangor in County Down, which is
I've preached there a few times. Yeah.
yeah, big, I mean, you've been there, it seats about 8 or 900,
Yes.
kind of
Yes.
historic, kind of preaching station kind of vibe. So being after nearly 6 years in Hamilton Road, and then moved to Dublin, and in the smaller of the two churches, there were 12 people. And I don't think I'm being unfair to say one of the 12 was a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And so 11 of the 12 people were angry at me because I was preaching for 11 or 12 minutes from the Bible. And they were struggling with this from about 2 minutes. And the 12th person, he was mildly, grumpy with me because I wasn't preaching for 35 minutes like he'd heard me in Hamilton Road, 6 months earlier. And realizing, that in a large church, one of the things I realized was I was looking around the church, and I could actually tell you the people's names,
Yes.
but I was looking at, Davy, one of the elders who sat over the clock in the back, and Evelyn, the church officer, who sat in the gallery, and my mate Ian, who sat on that side. And I realized after they were always those people who listened like this,
Yes.
who like leant forward and drunk it in, and I kind of been tuned out everybody else. And then I went to Dublin, and there were only 12 people in the room, and all 12 of them were not wanting to be there and not wanting to listen to me. And
Yes. Yeah.
after about three minutes, I'm going, oh my goodness. So I think having to learn, and
Mm.
having to take some of the things that Chapo had begun to
Yes.
learn from Chapo, but but having to learn to preach to 12 people who didn't want to listen to you
Mm.
and make them stick with you, for even for 10 or 12 minutes.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a shock, but I think it was really, really
Yeah.
formative.
Yeah. Good learning curve. Yeah.
And
I think
yeah,
my earliest
well, there was
exposure.
one elder.
Go
Yeah,
on.
there was one elder after 6 months came to complain to me, and I mean, he said himself he wasn't a Christian. That was great, but he said, I really don't enjoy church anymore. And I said, no, I'm really sorry about that. He said, why is, I said, why is that? He said, oh, he said, it's hard to explain. He said, you kind of expect me to listen to the sermon and then you make me do it. And I didn't know what to say to him, but inwardly I was cheering. I was going, oh,
Yes.
thank you, God. Then he said he'd been coming to church for years, but he really liked to just take the time to plan for the week ahead and kind of gather his thoughts and use the quietness. And I was interrupting his
Good challenge.
quietness, with my with my 10 minutes on Mark, So yeah,
Amazing. Yeah. I think my earliest exposure to Australian preaching was the Jensen brothers, because I used to go
yeah,
to Dick Lucas uh,
yep,
meetings when I was in London for several years, and he would bring those
yep,
guys over, for example. And I think I was, and
yep,
then Chapo as well, of course. He was around in those days, and that was my
yep.
first exposure to sort of Australian approach to the full on, plain speaking.
I think, I think, let's just say what was exported, it tended to be a little more concentrated than what was kind of on offer
Okay.
locally. Yeah, I think one of the great strengths of Australia, and especially Sydney, because it is um, from a distance, it's not easy to appreciate. There is kind of Sydney, and then there's everywhere else,
Okay. Okay.
and that like there was real gospel strength in Sydney, and obviously the Sydney Anglicans are, the kind of, thank God for their legacy, what they do
Sure.
in Sydney. But basically everywhere else in Australia is quite different,
Yeah. Okay.
and Sydney has been a significant influence. But I think, the strengths are, an absolute clarity on the gospel
Yes.
and kind of cutting through and making sure that we take seriously the demands of the gospel and don't ever forget, the imperative to take the gospel as the church, to nations.
Yeah.
But I think like it, like any tradition, um, I think this has been a lesson for me. I think sometimes your strengths produce unintended consequences
Hmm.
down the track. And often, this isn't a criticism of Philip or Peter, but even sometimes, the word Philip is a brilliant preacher. But when people who are not as brilliant try to preach like Philip,
Yes. Yes.
it doesn't. I mean, It was the same with Mr. Sill.
Yeah.
Mr. Sill could do it, but if people tried to imitate it, it was a pale imitation of the real thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think sometimes, it's interesting, kind of coming from my background and being influenced, being Irish and coming from Scotland. I think for a long time, although I do think this is changing, um, a lot of Australian preaching, it probably lacked a bit of heart.
Hmm. Hmm.
It was clear, it was evangelistic, it was pushing for, for action, but it wasn't necessarily terribly warm.
Hmm.
And often, the application was generally, it was serve, it was share the gospel with people, but it wasn't necessarily gasp with amazement at the glory of God,
Yes. Yes.
or you know, or realize how much He loves you and throw
Hmm.
yourself on Him in love in return.
Hmm.
That so I think often the kind of affectional
Yes.
component
Understood.
wasn't a particular strength.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do think that's something that I think a lot of us across Australia have been grappling with and saying,
Okay.
we need to think seriously about that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gary, knowing what you now know after many years in ministry, what advice would you give your younger self as you began?
Uh, uh, learn humility quickly. Save yourself a long, slow, painful journey. Um, I think, yeah, I think I would. Yeah, I'm not sure I would have listened to myself because I think this is what I was trying to do. But I think um, be content to preach the word in season and out of season, and love the people that God has put in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
God will bring other things to you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and
Yeah, yeah.
in the resources He gives you, you'll be able to do some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
But that really is the main game. I was reflecting just I over the last years, I've got to know Don Carson a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He's been very encouraging to us here in Brisbane. And really, when Don got sick, kind of around Christmas, I was just reflecting actually on the influence that Don has had on me, just as an encouragement and praying for us and cheering us on. But I thought, I I've heard Don a lot over the years, and I thought, I've never heard Don. I've heard, some talks that I thought were just brilliant, and some talks that I thought we're good, like everybody else. But I thought I've never heard Don speak, didn't seriously engage with the passage,
Mm-hmm.
and really work at trying to apply the message of the text to the people in front of him.
Yes, yes.
And I just thought, what, actually, like, again, Don's a unique individual, but in that, I kind of feel like, yeah, okay, Don's my hero.
Mm-hmm.
I do, as I get older, I want to be someone that people will go, well, you know what, if we ask Gary, we know exactly what we'll get.
Yeah, yeah. I understand.
He'll have wrestled with the text, and he'll have given it his best shot.
Yes, yes.
And maybe it may be good. It may be good, bad, or different. But I think, no. I do have control over that.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. Yeah.
And I think that's what I do. I do want to kind of
Mm-hmm.
I want to bore our students with that. That's what we can control.
Yeah, yeah. That's very wise. That's great. Don, I heard Don speak a few times as well. So obviously, read a lot of his stuff. And the point you make is exactly right. What strikes me about most of what I remember from Don Carson's preaching is when he handled some fairly oblique Old Testament prophetic texts. I remember Ezekiel, and he just walks you through it and brings it alive and paints a picture and then presses the application home. I've never known anyone like do that for passages in the Old Testament like he does. It's just remarkable.
Yes, yeah.
It's not emotional. It's not dramatic. It's just straightforward.
But my wife Fiona teases me about the time Jim Packer came to Gilcomston,
Mm-hmm.
and I think probably on reflection as a writer, like, Packer is probably the person who shaped my thinking and theology as much as anyone, really. And I was so looking forward to kind of my hero coming, and I don't know. I presume the recording may still be available through Gilcomston, but he preached on the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, and he preached for about 23 minutes, and I was utterly underwhelmed. And Fiona said, like, what's wrong? And I said, that was just so simple. Which she laughed at me at the time, deservedly.
Yeah.
I mean, looking back, it was a model
Mm-hmm.
of, a great man with a brain the size of a planet,
Yes.
taking us through a part of the Bible beautifully simply,
Yes.
and applying it to the people in front of him. And
Yes.
that's what I should have been aiming for.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And again, I just say to our students, I say, look, my great mistake as a younger man was I was always aiming for complexity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was aiming for depth and richness, and because often you'd listen to I listened to great preachers, but I mean, for me, back in those days, on cassette, and
Yes.
you'd listen to Martin Lloyd Jones or something, and then and then as
I mean,
a 19-year-old try to preach like him, and I was always trying to sound, at the beginning, I was trying to sound like one of the great ones.
yes. Yeah.
And I think it took me a long time, but eventually the penny dropped that, actually all I could, the best I could hope for is to sound like myself.
Yes.
And this is all I've got.
Yeah.
But, just get on,
Yeah.
handle the scriptures, do what I can do and do it well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
weirdly, I actually think Alistair Begg is
I agree.
I think Alistair's just such a great example of that.
Yeah. I agree entirely. Absolutely. Yeah.
In a massive context with a huge reach.
Yes.
But there is a sense in which, Alistair, as he preaches, sounds like an older version of person I first heard 30 odd years ago.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I sometimes say to my students, the mark of a good preacher is you go away thinking, yeah, I could have come up with that if I thought about it.
Yeah.
It's not that complex. But just here's a man who's lived in the text and brought it out. But if you come away from a preacher thinking, wow, that was clever, then I'm not convinced by the quality of that preaching. That's my...
Oh, yeah. That's right. I say to our guys, the worst thing anybody could ever say to me is, oh, that was brilliant. I have no idea how you managed to get that out of the text.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we do want it to be. I mean, in some ways, we do want preaching to be a kind of God honoring, God saturated statement of the obvious.
Yes, that's a good description. Yeah.
And I think because I do a fair bit of Old Testament preaching, and in college chapel, I regularly preach. It's not a church. It's a very eclectic gathering of people who are going to, be sitting there all week listening. So the talk's about 40 minutes, but even then, I actually desperately want people to be able to look at the text after and go, okay, I don't care whether they remember my headings or the words I use, but I want them to be able to look at the text and go, yep, I get what God is doing here. And I want them then, as a result, to be thinking about how this applies to them.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Gary, as an observer of and listener to preaching, what concerns you about the general state of preaching, and what encourages you?
I think we were chatting about this earlier. I think what concerns me is that people are distracted from doing the painstaking work of doing your exegesis, read it, making sure you read enough to understand the text, apply the text, and also kind of think about the implications. I think just I'm slightly concerned that people aren't quite sweating as much over the text.
Okay.
I think certainly in our context, I think the general standard has kind of been rising for quite a long time. But I think the danger is that it will now start to decline because I think the problem is you can preach adequate sermons for a while.
Yes.
But it is, my experience certainly is, it is really hard to keep going. And we do fall into, we're capable of falling into all kinds of bad habits. And so we do need to keep self-correcting and, reining ourselves in. I think the encouraging thing is, in our context, I think people are working harder at application than they have been for some time.
Okay.
And that there is just a general willingness to seek to preach to the heart. I mean, there's a friend of mine, Murray Capel, who's a Kiwi New Zealander here, who's written a great book called "The Heart Is the Target."
I've got it sitting right beside me here. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, and Murray's a great preacher, and just thinks really carefully about how we apply it to the people sitting in front of us.
Yes.
And I think in Australia, I think we've seen quite a lot of people go, okay, yeah, there was a piece missing
Hmm.
in our preaching, and we're going to have to work harder at that. So I think that's
Yeah.
but I think in all these things, inevitably where we focus on one thing, it is
Yes.
almost inevitable that we'll start to neglect something else.
Another aspect.
So
Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
yeah,
Yeah. Sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm overall encouraged, but I am worried. I am worried that nobody's going, or very few people are going to preaching conferences. They're
Mhm.
going to conferences on,
Yes.
you know, leaving the church or strategy. Now,
Yeah.
not, and can be great Bible teaching there, and so on.
Yeah.
But
Sure.
I'm just sitting going, oh, I think I know what's going to happen here.
Yes. Yes.
And there'll probably be someone else will be having to try to fix this
Yeah.
in
Understood.
another 10 years.
Sure. Understood. What aspect of preaching, from the study to the delivery, do you find the most demanding, the most stretching? And has it always been that, or has it changed as the years and experience has gone?
Um, oh, I think I think application is the hardest.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think for me, it is still the most demanding. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I say to people, I do say to our students, like, there's something wrong if, we haven't done our job if you can't do exegesis,
Yeah.
by the time you come out of college, and I think initially probably for me, one of the hard things was, for me, it's writing an outline,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
like writing the talk is not particularly difficult. But I think setting up the talk for me is a crucial stage, and also for me, I think at some point I realized that if I need to spend relatively speaking, a long time con- mapping out the talk, writing my outline, and I need to set that up in a way that the whole talk is driving towards
Yes.
application.
Yes. Yeah. I'm with you.
Because if I do that,
Mm-hmm.
everything, the introduction, application isn't then something that I'm kind of sitting at 6 o'clock on Saturday night, scratching my head, going, "What do we do with this?"
Yes.
It
Yes.
has actually filled my head
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because I preach on a Tuesday, it's filled my head from Friday afternoon through to Tuesday, which does make it easier, but I still think it's demanding,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I think I think one of the hardest, I think for me, one of the hardest things remains, every sermon I preach. I always feel like when I finish my script, I just sort of sigh and go, "Yeah, there's another one that didn't live up to its early promise." When you read the passage, and even as you're thinking about it, and you get excited about it, and then and I kind of get my hands on it and go, "Yeah."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, God in His great kindness. I don't know if you ever skip that. I'm more convinced than ever that God uses His word, and how I feel about the talk is really neither here
Yeah.
nor there.
Yeah.
But I think that the kind of weekly rhythm of
Yes.
the fear that the first day you sit down with a blank sheet. I think it is minimized over the years, but it's still there.
Still there. Yeah. I understand.
And and I think, I don't know. Yeah, I think a lot of us are like this, but I think for me the worst 2 minutes of the week are actually after I've preached,
Okay.
and I'm quite sociable, and our college is a very warm, kind of fairly intimate community, but when I walk our auditoriums upstairs, but as I walk down past my office every week, I really do just want to go into my office and close the door and feel sorry for myself for a
Okay.
few, which is not
Yeah, I
neither
understand.
helpful nor
Yeah.
godly. And I always do go downstairs, but
Yeah. 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 Well, just a couple of weeks ago, one of my students passed me a quote from Brian Croft in the States, who has a wonderful analogy about pointing out that no matter how good or bad your sermon is, it doesn't alter your standing before God. He still loves you
Yes,
unconditionally.
yes, yeah,
And he used the
yeah.
analogy of fishing. And he says, most Sundays, the fish the sermon you just preach, you really just want to throw back in the water. But every now and then, there's one you want to take to a taxidermist,
Yeah.
And our emotions tend to go with that. Is this one for stuffing or is this one for throwing? It's,
Oh yeah, and I mean, I do remember early on in Dublin on Good Friday, like I preached a terrible sermon, and I mean, when I don't know if you've been preaching and you've realized you're not even entirely sure what you're trying to say,
yes, yes,
and you hear the words come out, and you're going, I don't understand this. I don't know how anyone else will.
yes,
And I did. I went home and I remember going to bed early, and I was just miserable. Like I don't. This was an acute case of the kind of feeling sorry for myself. And a girl from church phoned me, and she was in tears. And I remember thinking, yeah, I would have been in tears if I'd had to sit through that too. And then she said, Gary, I just want to tell you, I've been in church my whole life. I've never understood grace before, and I wanted to interrupt her and say, I don't think after that, I don't think you do understand it. And she said, I've just become a Christian,
wow,
and it's like my life. I know my life has been transformed,
yeah, yeah,
and I think for me that was a really important
yes,
lesson.
yeah,
Because objectively, I mean, it was terrible. I mean,
yes,
that's
yeah.
not. I'm not being
Sure, I understand.
self-deprecating. It was just a poorly formed kind of ramble.
Yes.
And I think that just, for me, that has always been a guard,
Hmm.
and say, look, actually, I am no judge of anything.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm trying to remind myself of that. It is God's word. And
sure.
sometimes it's harder to believe, actually, to really believe that when you think it's gone really well.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yes,
know, um, and when it's gone badly, and even sometimes. I mean, I think I've been at it long enough to know that you can't even gauge it by how many comments, if any, you get.
hmm hmm
After what audible response you get from
yes,
people.
yes, no, that's right.
It's
Yeah,
God does His work through His word,
yeah.
and
And when you have those
we'll
occasions,
never see the full extent of that.
that's right. And when you have those occasions when, you think you're just a complete disaster, but God has used it, because you can't
Yeah,
take any credit for that because you thought it was a complete disaster. That's God working in spite of you. And I've been there a few times.
exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yes, and in His mercy, He doesn't. He doesn't limit us.
Yes, yep.
No, I mean, I would have said I preached this morning. The tone was off. I just, and yet, I had three or four conversations.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't think I wouldn't preach that sermon again.
Hmm.
And yet, I had three or four substantial conversations during the
Yeah,
day
yeah,
where God had clearly spoken directly into specific situations in
yes,
students' lives, and you just go,
yeah.
"Well,
Good.
thank you, God. It's all of your mercy."
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. Gary,
yeah.
one more question, and I know in your role you'll be in this position frequently. What piece of advice would you give somebody who comes saying, "I think God is calling me to be a preacher"?
Um, I think I would ask that is anyone else telling you that,
Hmm. Hmm.
as the first question.
Hmm. Hmm.
And again, it depends. I mean, I don't, um, I, I do want to say why.
Hmm. Hmm. Good. Yeah.
It's that, it's the old ordination kind of question,
Yes.
that certainly in my word, are the glory of God, the building of His kingdom, your chief and highest desire, which is always an arresting question for any of us to answer
Absolutely.
wholeheartedly. But
Yeah.
is there evidence that we want to preach Christ for the good of the church and the glory of God?
Hmm.
Um, something of that.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I have realized, because training pastors take a long takes a long time. And I think, my own particular journey, I do look back at places and think, my goodness, I thought I thought I knew such a lot when I knew so very little. And, there were points I would have said the process I went through was certainly not on the over scrupulous side.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what we try to do here is mirror a generosity that allows for the fact that God works slowly and gradually in all of us,
Mm-hmm.
but also looking for that a kind of central desire to honor God,
Yeah.
and also affirmation of his people.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Um,
Sorry, let me just throw one more quick. I started asking guys on this for one book on preaching that perhaps has helped you more than any other. You're completely entitled to mention Saving Eutychus if you want, by the way.
no, absolutely not.
But is there one book that you would recommend every preacher really should read this?
There are a lot. I mean, weirdly, I still think, although it's dated, I think I believe in preaching.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's still it's the book that gave me the reason to start on this track.
Mm.
And I think, in classic kind of John Stott, it's so ordered and logical. And I got to the end of it and thought, well, yeah, that's that one settled.
Mm-hmm.
And then in a sense I went to Aberdeen and saw Mr. Still do it. And at that point I've never really questioned,
Sure.
that this is the way to go. So I think that, and I do think there were two talks that Tim Keller gave at the EMA, on preaching. It was kind of, one of them was his kind of, legalism and religion, preaching the gospel to legalists and to antinomians. Preached that it was some of what Keller said about preaching to the heart that actually, I think, transformed the way I thought, from it's my job to explain the text to, actually, the task of preaching is to preach the gospel to wherever people are at.
Yes.
And I think a lot of kind of things that I'd thought about just came together. So I don't think Tim's book on preaching, it wouldn't be kind of one of my favorite books on preaching, but where he talks about the necessity of preaching in a way that actually cuts through and connects.
Sure, understood.
With people, that was a bit of an eye opener for me, because I think before that I just thought preaching was explaining passionately.
Yes.
So that's sorry, that's a bit of a wandering answer, but I think it doesn't matter where you get it from. So I think, actually, sorry, can I revise that? The one book I would actually get everybody to read, and do get everybody to read, is Murray Capel's The Heart is on Target.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Which reminds me, I've got his name on my list to drop in an email and ask him if he'll do an interview with me. So if you can put a word in for me, I would be very grateful.
I will do. I certainly will.
Gary, thank you for taking up your evenings to talk to me. It's been an absolute delight. I really appreciate it.
It's been lovely to meet you and to talk to you.
And the Lord bless your ongoing ministry there in Queensland.
And yours in Scotland. And you never know, we may cross paths
in
never bonny know. Scotland before too long.
Good.
Excellent.
Thank you, my brother. The Lord be with you.
You too. Have a good day, John.
And you. Bye.